Okay, so today's video, we're going to talk about conditioning. I want to get straight into this, get it out the way. I want to try and keep this video as short as possible because last time it was quite long. So conditioning. I think this is a really important topic. It's something which I try to teach teams basically from day one. I believe that this is a tactic that is used at the pro level and quite heavily. And around about the advanced to MDL level, it's where teams slowly get introduced with the idea, or maybe they develop it into their game sense. So I believe for everyone, this is a really useful topic. It'll be something that's very good for people to develop themselves into and learn how to do. So what is conditioning? Right here, basically, I've summarized it really quickly. It's using a technique in order to make the opponents play differently from maybe how they want, or to play how you want them to play. So there's a lot of different ways that we can do this as players. The main one, which I typically focus more towards, is utility conditioning. But to better understand it, there's a quote here which basically I've got. It's understanding the opponent's repetition compulsion and abusing it. Now, what repetition compulsion basically means is, I've taken this quote off Wikipedia. It's a trait in which a person repeats an event or a circumstances over and over again. Now, just a quick example of what that might look like. Let's say somebody's playing Mirage. There might be an AWPer. The AWPer, when he gets a good spawn here, might always run towards connector. Now, if the AWPer has a spawn which is here, then he's always going to go window. So you might start to see that basically every single round there's an AWPer window, and he goes there no matter what happens, even if there's a smoke. And you might also see that sometimes the AWPer then goes connector, and he's there no matter what happens. If there's a smoke, if there's no smoke, if there's a smoke top mid, etc. And this is basically understanding that the opponents maybe have some form of repetition compulsion, and it's about abusing that fact. How do we take what the opponents are doing and make them do it differently? Now, not all players have repetition compulsion. Some players just do things off the top of the head, depending on the situation, etc. And then we have to use a little bit more advanced topics. But 50% of the use case will be abusing this. So, the 5 main ways. We have utility conditioning, we have information conditioning, we have tactics that enforce conditioning, which is typically related to defaults or, let's say, map control. We have rotation conditioning as well. The examples I will give are Mirage. And then the final one will be pre-strat conditioning. So let's run through these. I'll give some really quick examples, get them all out the way, so that we can hopefully understand a little bit more onto the topics of conditioning. So, utility conditioning. As I mentioned before, this is the topic that I will focus 100% of my attention on when I do obviously spend time with teams. When I spend time with individuals, with players and develop players, I will mainly focus on getting them to improve their utility conditioning. So, these quick examples. HE center train on the A site. So if we go on the map train, then what that means is basically it's quite common that if a player wants to come sandwich, then they might come straight through connector, they'll go over the center bomb train and they'll go towards a sandwich. So what you might want to do is, if you see this sort of type of behavior from the opponents, then it might be in your interest to say, throw a grenade straight out of main on the round start, which basically lands center bomb train. So what that's going to do is it's going to convince this player to, instead of going over the top of bomb train, that he might now go this way, or he might even go this way, which would then allow an AWPer to basically take those kills a little bit easier because you have a little bit better timing. So that's the first example. The next one, the HE Molo Mirage connector. So what that basically means is a lot of players, especially on the A site players, they might come this way and they might peek connector from down here. They might also come this way and they'll peek it maybe from this angle. So they'll peek top mid immediately after round spawn. So if you notice again this type of behavior, then it might be in your interest as a terrorist side to Molotov this sort of area. And what that means is it might convince that opponent, maybe at the beginning of the round, I shouldn't just go straight into connector and try and take a peek. Instead, they might throw a smoke, which is quite often what you see, and they'll have to use utility in order to get away from your Molotov. So, next section, HE Overpass B Boost. This is something that Big do, Astralis do, lots and lots of teams do this. In fact, I'm pretty sure every team does this nowadays. But basically, if you notice that opponents like maybe throwing a Molotov which lands here, then there's a good chance that they could also be a guy towards boost, or maybe even 2 guys boost, and they could be jump peeking or holding this angle to make sure that you don't obviously push through, etc. Or they might just be holding there even without a Molotov, just 2 guys sat on the boost. So what teams typically do is they'll take 3 terrorists to this location, and they'll all triple nade this section. So again, another useful piece of conditioning. If you see opponents playing around the boost area, or maybe around this jungle area here, then it could be a good indication that there is an easy way to convince this player to stop playing there. Just triple nade it. So next one, HE Molotov on Inferno Banana. Now, most people in Europe especially call this the Fallen Molotov. What that means is typically you'll have the T side. If you notice that the opponents they want control of this section right here, then it might be in your interest as a terrorist side to come up in this section right here and throw a Molotov which lands on this corner. What that's going to do is it's going to give you as a terrorist side 5 seconds to basically separate any players which were playing here. They'll move back, or they'll move forward into a more dangerous position, and they'll potentially be separated from each other. So if you have a guy here and a guy holding this corner, and this Molotov lands, it's going to push this player further back, and then if you capitalize on that one round, the next round that the opponents see this Molotov, they might not want to play there anymore, and therefore you might be able to condition or convince them not to play for top banana control with just one simple Molotov. So a really useful Molotov that can potentially have mental long-lasting effects on the rest of the game. And the final one, HE Stack Mirage Window. This is something that Astralis love to do, especially when they're on pistols. So it is something that AWPers need to be aware of when they're against pistols. They'll typically throw on the T side, if they notice that there's always an AWPer going window, or maybe even just a rifler, then they'll obviously throw a top mid smoke on some rounds. They'll come with 3 players, or maybe even 5 players, and they'll all HE grenade the window. Now what this is going to do is it's going to obviously tell the opponent that maybe if he sees this top mid smoke, that he isn't fine just to sit behind it and aim down these angles to make sure that no one's pushing, because he could potentially now take a triple or even 5 nades in the face. So another really useful piece of conditioning that tells the opponents this smoke does not mean you are safe to sit in window. That's utility conditioning. Now, I don't think there's any need to go in any more detail about that. The examples I give, basically you can apply this to anywhere that if the enemy is playing certain positions, they do certain types of things, then you can apply utility conditioning. The main ones that you're going to want to focus on is HE grenades and Molotovs. You can use smokes. Smokes can be effective from time to time, and also flashbangs can also be a useful way of convincing the opponent to stop playing in a certain position, but they're not going to have as long of a lasting effect as potentially taking 2 nades to the face or 3 nades to the face, or just being burned alive in a Molotov. So these 2 pieces of utility are the most effective for utility conditioning. So next, information conditioning. Now this is the complete other side of the game to utility conditioning, where one, you're focused on convincing the opponents through usually damage to stop playing in a certain position or stop doing a certain thing. And the other one is using information on your side to basically convince the opponent that they need to either play somewhere or they need to stop playing somewhere. So first one that I've got, and this is quite a fun one, is obviously overpass long using noise. So what that means is, let's say you notice that enemies like to play in this sort of section right here, or they like to play for sort of mid-map control, then it might be in your interest as a terrorist side team to make some form of loud noise towards a long, which would basically, if you do this a couple rounds in a row, it might start forcing the CT side, instead of maybe playing in connector or in mid, they might start having to play long, thinking that, oh, they're going long every round, so we need to maybe hold the defense there. And what that could do in turn is free up the mid side of the map, for you guys as terrorists to take connector control, to maybe take mid control. It could also force a guy maybe on the B side who's playing towards heaven to rotate up towards A, hold this angle if they are playing to mid, which would then make the B side weaker. So again, bit of noise, bit of utilizing sound on overpass, for example, here to convince the opponents to play a little bit differently to maybe how they want. The next one, rush fakes for Mirage B. Similar sort of situation, so typically on Mirage you're going to find a 1-3-1 default is the most common. It's changing a little bit to more like a 2-2-1, etc. for this map, but most cases this is what you're going to see on the T side. Let's say you notice, for example, that an opponent is always playing short and always giving hassle to your guys here, then it might be in your interest as this solo T side player towards the B side to, at the beginning of a round, fake a rush. Maybe just throw some flashes, 1 flash over the top, maybe throw a smoke which lands in this section right here. And what that could do is convince this short player to start focusing his attention here. So again, you're utilizing information, you're giving the enemies information that you could be potentially doing a rush, and it's going to convince this player to start focusing his attention more towards this location right here. Another good use of conditioning. And the next one is applying pressure to opponents. So this is basically just something that we do in almost every single game, and it's just simply applying pressure to a certain location. So let's say you obviously see that the opponents are playing heavy connector, then it might be in your interest to maybe start playing full mid and putting incredibly heavy pressure in connector. So this is obviously going to convince the opponent, if they can't beat out you guys in mid, that maybe they just stop playing connector and they start playing in this section above connector, top connector, for example. There's obviously lots of ways you can do that. I can give a really quick example. You could have, let's say, your A player or someone at the beginning of the round smoke top connector, and then obviously you can get some good pop flashes in, maybe a molly on the right side of connector, as you guys are all flooding in and maybe attacking from multiple angles. You do this enough to a player that plays in connector, he's eventually going to say, okay, I've had enough. These guys always take connector control, I'm just going to leave it. And then maybe he'll go towards window, he'll go play on the A site, or maybe they'll play double short. So it's convincing that opponent by certain tactics, pressure tactics, to play in a different position. So, sorry that I am skipping through these very quick, but it's a very easy subject, and I believe everyone can benefit from me just skipping ahead here. So tactics that enforce conditioning. So I've put here usually map control, we'll put that in brackets, so to say. Now, there are some really good examples that I can give, and these are the best ones that I can think of. So Astralis Inferno mid. On the Inferno map, Astralis basically have one single mid take, and they do this every single time, which is a long smoke and a short molly. Now, this is off their default. So this is map control. They want brackets control, this section right here. And they apply always this one smoke and this one single molly. And they do this every round, regardless of if they go there or not. They will typically throw these two pieces of utility in unison with one another, and what that's going to do is it's going to convince the opponents, maybe they do that one round and they take mid, maybe the next round they just throw it and they don't take mid and instead they rush 5 up banana. And what that could do is basically have a more psychological effect on the opponent. They see that utility coming in, they might leave mid, for example. Anyone playing here might disappear this way, anyone playing long might disappear this way, and then obviously you're then 5 guys on the B site, they think you have brackets control, and this is again another sort of tactic that you could apply. If you do this enough, 3 or 4 rounds in a row, the opponents will think that this utility means taking mid, and instead then you can use that to your advantage by then attacking another site or doing some other kind of tactic on top of that. So the next one, train A site smokes. This is something you again see in pretty much every single default, is at the beginning of almost every single round on train, you're typically going to see a smoke which lands sort of here and a smoke which sort of lands here. Now, these two smokes obviously have certain purposes. For example, if an AWP is here, you can't just aim down this site, and if there's a guy who wants to play sandwich, he's either going to have to go this way, he's going to have to go on top of the train, or he's going to have to push through this smoke. So obviously he puts himself at risk. Now, the good thing about using these smokes every round is, if you were to use them on your default, where you just play nice and passive, you go Ivy, you go main slowly, you take brown hole slowly, and maybe even pop. And then the next round, or after 5 or 6 rounds, the opponents get used to, okay, these two smokes mean the enemies are on a default, so we can relax, we don't have to throw as much utility. And then you all of a sudden do a full out A execute off good spawns, where you throw these two smokes, and then maybe you apply molly here, molly here, molly here, for example, and obviously certain flashbangs which land in certain different locations. Then you can convince the opponents that these two smokes are default smokes, but you've just applied it to a rush. So now the opponents aren't exactly 100% sure if when they see these smokes they have to be cautious. Is it a rush or is it now a default? And they'll start using utility every single round to then block off that fast rush, in which then you can again use to your advantage. So that's another one that almost every single team uses. Now the third example is Inferno CT banana control. So we mentioned this before with the utility. Obviously what I mean by that is when teams play Inferno, they'll typically focus their attention towards the default banana. So if you can convince with playing the default every round, if you do like a certain tactic, for example, we even mentioned doing the fallen Molotov, maybe double or triple nading this section right here, and convincing the opponents to leave this section right here, then what that means is basically at the beginning of certain rounds, if you notice that the opponents have started leaving this section because of the conditioning that you're applying, you can just come up here, dump your one molly, and 5 guys attack A site. So again, you're applying what's been happening, the conditioning that you've been applying the past few rounds, convincing the opponents to stop playing in this section with certain utility, and sort of different sort of the tactic which is involved, which is the sort of default banana control. You can then apply the utility that you used on those tactics and make the opponents think, oh, they're just taking banana control, and all of a sudden 5 guys jump out of apartments, or 4 guys jump out of apartments. So that's the beauty of conditioning with tactics. Now the next one I want to mention, rotation conditioning. So again, this is another sort. So what our goal is with this is basically to convince the opponents the route that they want to, if they're going to rotate, then it's obviously going to cause problems for the rest of the team. And if they are obviously rotating, then they need to be wary of the possible dangers. Now, I have a use case here, an example, which is, it's very fought after in the fact that you would never really use this, but it could potentially work, and the potential is what we're looking for. We're looking for this potential. So this is an advanced rotation cut tactic, which I thought of, which I'm still yet to test, but I believe it has its possibility. Let's say your mid guys notice on Mirage that there's always a CT AWP that always goes window. And if you smoke window, you notice, or the guys mid maybe notice, that this CT player likes a then go connector. So you know his rotation is through this section right here. Now the way you could deal with this is you could have a guy in Palace, and he could look to this location. When this guy's rotating, he can try and take that kill. However, 9 times out of 10, especially when playing at a high level, this is going to be smoked. So that's not really going to work. So what you could do is, if you know he's going to take this route, then maybe you could wait until maybe the mid smoke is thrown. So you could throw it from the T spawn. You could throw it to this location right here. When you believe that he's starting to rotate around, you could have 3 teammates here, so 3 T-side players. And all 3 of them could, for example, throw a nade which lands exactly in this section. Now, it might not work. In fact, 9 times out of 10, it probably won't do anything. However, it's the psychological effect that this could have on that rotating player. So the guy who rotates through this location right here, if as he's passing this point, 3 nades potentially hit him on the head, they might not kill him, but he might now be thinking, holy crap, maybe I need to not rotate through this location because I've just been triple naded off the opponents knowing that I was going to rotate through that area. And you can apply this to basically anywhere. So if it's train, overpass, wherever, you have to think about, where do players play, how do they like to rotate, and how do we do something about that rotation. So as I mentioned here, I said if you see there's an AWP playing window, and maybe after he's done window, maybe after it's smoke, he goes CT, it's the same thing. So you could potentially do a lurk smoke out here. You could take 3 T-side players here, and all 3 of you at the same time, if you believe the AWPer is rotated to CT, you could all throw a nade down to CT and potentially kill the AWPer playing here. So it's thinking about those sort of rotation on conditioning, convincing the opponent that just because they've rotated into a new position doesn't mean they're by any means safe. And the next one, so that's obviously with utility, and that's obviously with tactic based, so conditioning the rotation. And the next one is information. So again, we'll go back to Mirage. So sound cue B apps while attacking A site. Now what that means is, let's say you've got a guy up towards B apps, and your teammates are attacking the A site. So let's say maybe they're doing a smoke execute, maybe it's a smoke like this. It could even be a split. Now, as this player which is sat behind in the B apps, you might not be able to have any direct effect right at that moment that your teammates are starting to attack. So what you could do is you could cut that rotation, or you could stop the potential of a rotation fully happening by applying sound. Now what that means is, let's say they have a guy short, and you're in B apps, and you know that your teammates are about to attack the A site, then you could, for example, exactly that moment, rush towards B. Now, you don't have to go out, you don't have to try and take challenges, but if you make that sound, if this player then wanted to rotate through towards the A site, he's now going to hear that sound in the B apps, and he's going to focus his attention towards here. So you could potentially cut a rotation with sound. Now, if you do this enough, let's say you do this 3 or 4 times throughout your half, it's probably going to convince this short player that if he wants to rotate towards A, and every single time that he wants to do this, a guy in B apps starts making noise and giving him information that there's a player in the lurk position, then he might not be inclined as much to rotate, and then you could abuse that to your ability in future rounds. He might be convinced there's always a lurk, these guys always have a lurk B apps, so then you could start going 5 towards A, and he'll be none the wiser. Maybe he'll think, oh my god, a guy might come from B apps right now. So again, utilizing rotation conditioning with information. And the final one, to get it out of the way, is pre-strat conditioning. Now what this means is, you need to think about, when you guys are a team, teams are typically going to have strats. So let's say on Mirage it might be 3 smokes towards A. Or let's say on the B site it might be 2 smokes here and here. So what you can do is, leading up to potentially doing a certain strat, you as a player could potentially be throwing these types of this type of utility, etc. So when the opponents see it in future, they're none the wiser. They just think, oh, it's part of the default. It's part of what this player has been doing every single round. So for example, you can throw 2 smokes from this location which land here and here. If you did this every single round, even on the defaults, and then you did it on a rush, they might just think, oh, it's the default. You know, they're just doing this default. They just throw in that utility just to be a nuisance, just to be annoying. And maybe you had some guy sort of playing aggressive here on the default, and you do that exactly, you replicate that exactly on a strat, then that's pre-strat conditioning. So you apply half a part of the strategy so that when the opponents see it in the future, they're none the wiser. They just think it's part of the normal round. And that is basically pre-strat conditioning. The examples I have is a train A execute. We talked about that just a moment ago, where basically you put a smoke here and a smoke here. That's the same concept. And for Mirage, it's kind of the same thing, which I just mentioned. So it's about applying sort of smokes in certain positions. Let's say you want to take connector every round on the default, then you obviously throw this connector smoke. If you do that exact same connector smoke and then 5 guys come out ramp, the opponents are just going to be thinking, oh, they're going mid, they're taking connector, and then bang, 5 guys come out of ramp. And this is how you apply pre-strat conditioning. So, the final section, applying conditioning. How do you learn it yourself? Now, a question which I was asked recently by a player of mine was, how do we prepare for an anti-rush? Now, I'll give you the context. We were talking about Inferno. We played an official, and they kept getting rushed on Banana, and it was quite difficult for them. So my response to that, when I'm thinking from a conditioning point of view, is, what if you can convince the opponent not to even rush in the first place? Instead of preparing 100 different types of setups, crossfires, bait and switches, one and dones, all of these extra things for the CT side that you would have to learn, what if you could just convince the opponent, don't even rush in the first place? And this is the whole idea behind conditioning. It's about, don't think about how do you prepare for a certain round, but how do you convince the opponent to not even do that type of round? So if you don't want the rush, you could, for example, every single round, you could just double molly Banana. If you do that for 5-6 rounds in a row, the opponents are just going to start thinking, we shouldn't really rush there because we're just going to be sort of double mollied. Or the same with nades. You could, for example, double nade this section right here just before the logs. The timing's usually quite good here, so that if you throw from this location, if they are on a rush, because you're not nading too deep in this corner, you're not nading in this corner, they're typically just going to get absolutely bombarded with grenades, and it's going to be very difficult for them. So that is basically one way that you can think about from the CT side on a sort of, instead of preparing hundreds and hundreds of different ways of holding a defense, how do you stop the opponents from doing what it is that you would have prepared for? So that's one way about learning for the CT side setups. Don't necessarily have to learn 500 different setups. You can just convince the opponents not to even do something which you would need a setup for. Now what about, obviously there's a lot more complexity to the CT side than that, but I don't think we need to go much into that. Like, we can just think about these sort of tactics and apply them. Now, how do we come up with conditioning ideas for the T side? So there's 4 main things which I really try to focus on when I'm thinking about team sort of conditioning. The first one is double nades. So think of most common places that opponents play. If it's, for example, the B site, people like playing here, people like playing here, people like playing here. So you might, as a team or as a player who plays Banana, say, okay, why don't we learn a double nade which lands here, double nade which lands here, double nade that lands here, for example. And this is basically utility conditioning. So you can pick any map. You can think of common places where opponents play. So window, connector, short, here, on the balcony, under the balcony, on default. And you can try and think of, okay, how do we throw a double or a triple nade in these sections? Obviously, that basically covers for team side stuff, double and triple nades. Obviously, there's aggression. So one example I like to give is Inferno. Let's say if you were to throw, for example, if you want to do aggression on a certain round, like let's say you want to do aggression halfway through the game on round 7 or 8, let's just hope that you have a bye by that round. Then if the opponents are always smoking and mollying and nading this section right here, then it's going to make it very difficult for your AWPer to do anything. So what you might want to do is 3 or 4 rounds in advance to stop them from just necessarily mollying that and then instantly running up with it. Then what you might want to start doing is you could, for example, throw grenades over the top here. So if you do this for 3 or 4 rounds in a row, then the opponents are going to maybe hide in these corners right here, hide in underpass, and that you could maybe chain that with obviously aggression. And these sort of ideas you can come up with on your head. So you can think of any aggression. Let's say you want to aggress bottom mid. How do you do that? One thing you have to be aware of is guys coming up second mid. So how do we condition these players to not want to just push? For example, you could always be throwing a flash here on every single round, and maybe that could hold them back. And if you notice that they've started to be held back, then you could push down mid one round, throw this flash, and you know that these opponents are just going to be sat back here, for example. And this is basically the whole idea of how you come up with things yourself. Think about what you want to achieve and what the opponents will do in order to counter that, and then how do you limit that factor. So as I said here, your goal bottom banana. The opponents will obviously try to kill you from this location and this location, so how do you condition here and here to stop the opponents doing such a thing? And then you come up with your ideas. You look over utility conditioning, information conditioning, the tactics, the rotation, the pre-strat. You think of all of these different things, how do we apply them? And then you come up with ideas for yourself. And the final one is reactionary. So obviously you can get protocols. So on Dust 2, for example, when applying conditioning, if you take long, the opponents take short. If you have control here, then the opponents really should have control here. If you take mid control, then they might push long. So you can take all of these really basic concepts and you can then apply conditioning to them. If you take long, it might be in your interest to molly short and potentially also attack short at the same time, because that could convince the opponents that where their usual protocol is just to push short, now they're getting attacked on short exactly the same time as they're losing long. So again, it's about thinking of different protocols that the opponents might have, and how do you abuse those protocols. And the final section, just to kind of finish it all up here, is as an individual, thinking about how to apply this stuff. I did a session recently with one of my players, and I want to sort of run through that session. It's really, really simple. It was on pop, so the pop control for train. Now, obviously, not all players are playing here, but this is just an example of basically how I got him to think more about how to condition the player playing pop. So it's quite common as a CT side, you're going to want pop control. If you have pop control, you have a lot of information, you know what the opponents are up to, you can even push up if they go B, then you can push up behind and get kills. Russian teams love doing this. So there's a lot of benefits to having pop control. Now if you're the player on the T side, playing full pop, holding pop, you have to deal with this player playing pop. So you need to think about where you're playing, so obviously you're the pop player, and where do your teammates play? Maybe you have a guy main, maybe you have a guy here, maybe you have a guy here. So if the opponents are always taking this section right here, you can use these guys to your advantage. If you want to try and attack a guy playing here, you can potentially coordinate this between the main guy and you above pop. You can potentially coordinate some form of calculated attack. You could potentially convince this guy to stop playing here by ramping up pressure on Ivy and forcing these players to fall back. That could expose a weakness in the defense towards pop because he can be attacked from this angle right here. So he might not want to necessarily put as much pressure towards pop. You could rush 2 guys out on the B site. You could ask your B hold guys to start putting more pressure on B, and that could convince the opponents to start playing 2 players here. So 1 con, maybe 1 white. And what that's good for is that could convince any CTs playing sort of aggressive towards this section to fall back, because they're not going to have the usual 4 people playing towards the A site. And that's basically, that's utilizing your teammates and thinking about how do we condition the opponent by using certain other areas of the map. If you're always attacking the B site, the pop guy might not want to play pop because he's going to be alone, he's going to be separated. Now the next one is obviously thinking about the goals. So if you see that they're always taking pop control, you know the goal of the opponent is pop. So if you can stop him from having that goal, you obviously are at the advantage. You could, every single round at the very beginning, you could molly pop. You could molly just outside pop, maybe start double nading it. And what that could do is convince the opponent, yeah, he wants pop control, but he's not allowed to have it. Like, if you're not allowed to have it, then neither is he. And this is, again, you're thinking about the goal of the opponent and the goal of yourself. You want pop, the enemy wants pop, so one of you has to win that. And if you can convince the opponent to give it up, you're the winning point. If the opponent stops you from having it, you're the one being conditioned. And your team will obviously lose from that. And the final one is obviously information. So using the information obviously around the map to figure out ways of conditioning. So if you know that if your main guy is telling you that there's always a guy playing sandwich, and then you obviously notice that there's a guy playing pop, then it could be in your interest as this pop player to think about conditioning on other parts of the map. So if they're playing here and here, then there's a good chance they're not playing 2 in this position right here, or maybe there is, but you have to evaluate that. So maybe as the pop player, you could speak with the player towards Ivy and say, okay, maybe you should start taking 3 players there and starting to ramp up pressure on this section to condition the opponents to start playing more 2 there. And if they play 2 players there, that could potentially mean that the B site only has 1 person playing here, because if you're using information that they've got guys here, they've got guys here, you're ramping up pressure here to make them start playing 2. That could mean that the B site only has 1. So it's about thinking about this information. How do you use the information to suggest new conditioning parts of the play? So we obviously skipped through a lot of information there. It might be worth giving it a rewatch if you're not 100% sure on all the information provided. But conditioning is really simple. For a basic summary, I like to refer to this every single time. It's using a technique in order to make the opponents play differently to how they want to play, or to make them play how you want them to play. And that is the beauty of conditioning. It's super, super simple. It's very, very easy to do if you do it correctly. And using the methods which I've explained, you can easily achieve this goal. Now, I'm going to leave that there for today. I don't need to go into any more detail. So if you have any questions, just comment down below. And that's all I've got for today. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.